All right, there we go. So everybody, you can see my slides, Charlie, yeah? All right, great. So what I was going to do was speak for at most 25 minutes. I'm gonna stop no matter what at 8 o'clock and really just open it up for any questions that anybody has. And I would say at any point when I'm speaking, I can see most of the people, but not everybody. If you have a question, just unmute and shout out, and we can take it right there, or else we'll have plenty of time from 8 to 8:30 to talk about any other specific things that people might want to raise. So as Gerald mentioned, I've been engaged in psychiatric research with children and adolescents for about 30 years. My current work is at the NIMH Intramural Research Program, but I really have a long interest in working with children. It really began in the Jewish camping movement, where I was very involved in the Midwest growing up. And I am a physician, so I went to medical school with the idea of becoming a pediatrician, and moved on to study child psychiatry, and really began as somebody who was working on primarily clinical problems with children and adolescents. So I did a lot of the early clinical trials on antidepressants, and was involved in a lot of the work that compared psychotherapy to antidepressants. At the NIH, the main thing that I do is I examine aspects of brain function with the hope of coming up with better ways of diagnosing problems and coming up with new treatments. And I was really going to talk about three things. I was going to give you a kind of broad outline to think about pediatric mental illnesses, and then focus really on what we call the emotional disorders, which are problems with mood and anxiety. Then I was going to talk about aspects of stress and how what we know about the relationship between stress and mental illnesses in children kind of informs us and gives us a leg up when we think about what are the best things to do in the pandemic. And then I'm going to open it up really for questions that people have really about anything. So this slide illustrates three broad groupings of pediatric mental disorders. And this is how we tend to think about them. One group includes things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disorders, and autism spectrum disorders. And these are conditions that, while they change a lot over time, they appear quite similar in their core underlying problems. In these other two lines, you see psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, that I'm not going to talk about, but then this big, thick gray line shows you the emotional disorders. And what this slide is designed to show you is that these disorders change a lot over time.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt? I'm not seeing that slide. Is everyone else?
Can anybody see a slide?
I just see your background slide.
Do you see it, Gerald?
So I see, yeah, it says the background. You haven't moved forward.
Oh, no, I have. Yeah, this is one of the reasons I sent you my slides.
Okay, so do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you pull up my slides? Okay. Thank you for being the
Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's good.
Okay, let me just give me 1 second.
Unshare me. No, it's not share. I'm gonna.
Okay, give me 1 second so I can share it.
Yeah, and I'll show you what you'll be seeing is you'll be seeing three different curves that will illustrate three different kinds of problems. The neurodevelopmental problems, the psychotic disorders, and then emotional disorders, which are the main things I'm going to be talking about. Now, I can try again, Gerald.
No, yeah, I've got it now. Let me see.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so that's what you should have been seeing. And that gray curvy line was the thing that I was just talking about, that the kind of change reflects the fact that there's a real high level of plasticity in emotional problems. And I'll say more about that in a second. You can go to the next slide, Gerald. So we tend to divide the emotional disorders into two groups of problems. One broad group of problems includes things like OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, trauma-related disorders or PTSD, and then all the other anxiety disorders. And the important thing to know about these problems is that the similarities among them are far greater than the differences, that it's quite common for children who have any one of these kinds of disorders to develop another one over time. Next slide, Gerald. So the other main category are the mood disorders. And unlike the anxiety disorders, which typically involve fears or apprehensions or worries, the mood disorders involve problems in mood, and it's typically sadness and irritability. These are the conditions that are most strongly associated with thoughts of self-harm or things like cutting. You can hit the next button, Gerald. And there are other mood disorders that are listed here, but they're much more rare than major depressive disorder and depressive disorders as a whole. One of the tricky things about mental health problems in children in general is that the boundaries between what's normal but somewhat unusual and what's abnormal are very blurry. They're very fuzzy. So as mental health professionals, it's not easy to take a very clear line and say, this problem on one side is clearly the sign of a disorder, and this problem, while it's extreme, is normal. We really have no means of doing that. The best way for us to do this is to think of something that we call impairment, and that means that the problem that the child is having is such that it makes it difficult for the child to do things that other children can do. So if you have a child who's having a problem, that's the first thing to ask yourself is, does this problem interfere? Does it prevent the child from doing things that other children can do? And classically, in mood disorders, it's usually the case that they fairly quickly interfere with functioning, and that is not always the case with anxiety disorders. It can be difficult to see where exactly the anxiety disorders are impairing. And for this reason, it's usually easier to spot a diagnosis of a mood disorder than an anxiety disorder. There are many questions about where you can go or where you should go when a child is having problems. I'll give you my number and my contact information at the end of the talk, but usually a really good place to start are pediatricians. Pediatricians are really trained to recognize these problems, and more they're comfortable with knowing where to reach out to get more help. You can hit the next, yeah, there you go. So this is a slide from a study that I've spent the first 25 years of my career doing, and I'm going to walk you through this. It was a study that was completed over about 20 years with two of my colleagues, particularly a brilliant scientist named Patricia Cohen, really beginning in the late 1980s through about 2010 or so. And what this shows you is that we followed 679 randomly selected children as they passed through adolescence, and we diagnosed whether or not they were having problems with anxiety. And we looked at the relationship between having problems with anxiety as a child or an adolescent and having any problem with an emotional disorder as an adult. And there are really three bottom lines to take away from this study. You can hit the next button, Gerald. So bottom line number one is that anxiety disorders are exceedingly common in childhood and adolescence. 253 out of these 679 randomly selected kids from the community suffered from a clinically impairing anxiety disorder. So what that means is it's not unusual at all for the child to have anxiety that interferes with their ability to function. Number two, hit the next slide. Almost all these children, 191 out of the 253, were completely fine when we saw them again in adulthood. So while the first point is that anxiety is very common, the second point is that it usually goes away. Now, people often think of anxiety as an insignificant problem because of this observation, but the third finding, if you hit the next slide, tells us that it's not insignificant because while it's very common and it usually goes away, most problems that we see in adults begin in childhood. So you can see that we saw 98 adults in this study that we had followed longitudinally who had a serious emotional problem. Of the 98, 62 of them, or 2/3, had their problem start as a significant anxiety disorder. So what this tells you is that if you are a parent of a child with an anxiety disorder, you can feel hopeful that your child is going to get over the problem on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not the kind of thing you want to ignore, particularly if it's interfering with your child's ability to function. Next slide. All right, so that's really kind of a primer about general aspects of psychopathology. Now I'm going to shift to talking about what we know in light of issues that are really pressing given the situation we have with the pandemic. You can hit the next slide, Gerald. All right, well, so we know from many, many years of research that there are very strong associations between exposure to stress and mental health problems, as well as exposure to stress and physical health problems. And we know in general that these effects are cumulative. The more stress you experience and the longer you experience this, the more likely it is that you're going to suffer from a mental health or a physical health problem. These risks are what we call probabilistic. That means that being exposed to stress is not fate. It doesn't mean you're definitely going to have a problem. It just means it increases your risk for having a problem. And there are huge individual differences in terms of how people respond to stress. And there are things that we can see in the lives of individuals that tells us that they're more or less at risk for having problems under stress. So one of the biggest predictors is if a child is having problems before they're exposed to stress. It's far more common that children who are having problems have them get worse with stress than it is that a problem arises de novo. The disruption in the life of the child is another major indicator of risk. And related to disruption of the life in the child, we know that disruptions in the family are particularly potent predictors of which kids are going to struggle and which kids are going to do well. So when you're thinking about what can you do for your kids when they're facing a lot of stress, the better that you can do at taking care of yourself and monitoring your own stress and realizing that parents are powerful conduits for the stress that is in our life to our children, that can make a big difference in terms of how children cope. There are clearly unique circumstances of the pandemic that we know are concerning. So in particular, we know that social isolation and loneliness is particularly difficult for children, and it's a powerful predictor of problems that children are going to face, in particularly problems with mood disorders and problems with depression. We also know that distance learning creates unique demands on children, both in terms of the experiences that they don't have, so important experiences with their friends and exposure to novel social circumstances that come with going to school, but also difficult things that they're not used to that they have to face. Learning from computers and being responsible for broader aspects of their learning than kids are often used to dealing with. And then again, we know that many families and parents are greatly affected by the pandemic, and we know that this has profound effects on children. Interestingly, we are fairly rapidly getting data on how children are doing under the pandemic. And it's more of a mixed bag than you might think. There have been slight increases in overall rates of disorder, but they haven't been as marked as many people thought they were going to be. And there's interesting mixes of problems that are new that, you know, we can kind of expect related to the extra stress that families are exposed to. But there are also some situations where children are actually having an easier time than they were before the pandemic, either because they're enjoying more time with their parents and their family, or because a lot of the things that were more difficult for some children, things like the social demands of school or the complexities of getting out of your house, that some children are having an easier time with the pandemic due to that. And a lot of us are worried for those children about what the transition is going to be like as we start moving back into the community. Next slide, Gerald. So there are a couple of things that you should really hold in mind. One is the general overall resilient nature of children. We know from research on a lot of other stressful circumstances, the 9/11 attacks, the Scud missile attacks in Israel, exposures to many natural and human disasters, that the overwhelming majority of children do well over time and do not suffer lasting harm from trauma. We also know that there are quite variable immediate reactions, that children manifest stress in many different ways, and that it can be difficult over many weeks to months to know exactly which child is going to face the most problem. The thing to keep in mind if you're worried about your child, number one, is this idea of impairment. When are children not able to do things that other kids can do, and to have a low threshold for reaching out to a pediatrician. Next slide. So a couple of other things to keep in mind, taking care of yourself, realizing that, you know, adults have needs too, and when we take care of ourselves, we're better able to handle the people around us, and to try to not get too far in front of yourself in terms of taking things one step at a time. Next slide. We talked a little bit about how to spot problems and where to go. And another important thing to keep in mind are some of the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most effective treatment that we have for anxiety disorders, both in children and in adults. And the idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that problems with anxiety result from the way in which we cope with threats and we cope with danger. And the important thing to recognize is that effective coping requires us to face our fears and to confront the things that are difficult for us, but to do it in a way that confers mastery. So usually when a person is having trouble facing their fears or having trouble overcoming things that are difficult for them, such as during events like the pandemic, there is a formula that we use that begins by identifying the things that are difficult for us and making what we call a fear hierarchy, which kind of lists things from the least upsetting or least threatening to the most. Next slide. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, so we create this fear hierarchy, and then we develop new techniques for coping with these things that we're afraid of. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show you a book that I would recommend anybody who has, yeah, there you go. So this kind of walks parents through these steps that I was showing you on the other slide. And, you know, on the one hand, typically, this is not the kind of thing that I usually recommend that families try on their own. Usually it's the kind of thing that you want to do with a therapist. On the other hand, the pandemic really is an unusual circumstance, and these principles are helpful both for children who are suffering from an anxiety disorder, but also for children who are just coping with typical stress that's brought on by unusual situations, such as the pandemic. So if you go back, Gerald, that the key idea is to be able to do what we call graded exposure. And the idea there is that children have to be able to build up to mastering the things that they're afraid of. And what we usually do is we work with the child so that they feel a great level of control, and we help them to be exposed to the things that they're afraid of in a graded or gradual way, kind of starting with the least frightening and then slowly building up. And that's the kind of thing that that book on the next slide can walk you through. You can keep going, Joe. You can. All right. So those were the main points that I wanted to make to give you that broad focus on pediatric mental illnesses, to talk a little bit about what we call the emotional problems, which are the mood and anxiety disorders, and then to talk about some of the unusual circumstances of the pandemic.